Good morning, fifth grade. We are going to continue with chapter 7, lesson 4. We did a little bit with the journal entries and our Explorer magazine. So let's go ahead and look at our research companion. So we're going to start with how did westward expansion impact people living in the United States? Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at our timeline first. It says in the 1820s, mountain men appear in the Rockies. 1830, we have Indian Removal Act is passed. 1841, first wagon train on Oregon Trail. In 1838, we have Cherokee are forced to relocate. And then in 1846, we have Oregon Treaty divides United States and Canada at the 49th parallel. In 1848, we have the Treaty of Guadalupe. Hidalgo is signed. All right, and the picture here is just a depiction of settlers on a trail traveling westward. So this isn't really actual settlers, it's somebody like redoing the picture. So it looks like it's from the time they were actually traveling in the west in the 1800s. All right, so again, our essential question for lesson 4 is how did westward expansion impact people living in the United States? So it says trails to the west. The first European settlers to travel west were fur traders who used Native American trails and lived in the wilderness. The Native Americans in the area often helped these mountain men survive. By the 1830s, there was less demand for furs, and the number of traders declined. New settlers consisted mainly of families who traveled in groups of wagons led by experienced guides. Their destination was the rich farmland of the Oregon Territory. It was said that these settlers had Oregon fever because of their desire to start new lives in the far west. Since 1818, Great Britain and the United States had shared a claim to the Oregon Territory after 1840. However, U.S. citizens began to believe their country should extend all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. This idea, called Manifest Destiny, led the U.S. President James K. Polk to negotiate the Oregon Treaty with Great Britain. The two nations agreed to extend the United States-Canada border at the 49th parallel of latitude all the way to the Pacific Ocean. U.S. citizens also began moving to Mexican territories that included what are now the states of California, New Mexico, and Texas. In the late 1840s, news of gold being discovered at Sutter's Mill drew 80,000 people to California. This flood of fortune hunters to California is known as the Gold Rush. We have life on the wagon train. Life on the trails was challenging but exciting. On the Oregon Trail, settlers had to travel for 6 months across about 2,000 miles of wilderness. Many families traveled in groups of wagons called wagon trains. These families were able to provide protection for one another. Most wagon trains consisted of wagons called prairie schooners, because their white covers looked like a ship's sails from a distance. This type of wagon was usually pulled by a team of oxen. The wagon had to carry everything the family would need for the journey and for its new home. The supplies included tools, weapons, food, seeds for planting, books, cooking utensils, spare wagon parts, medicine, and clothes. Each member of the family had jobs to do on the journey. Men drove the wagon and were responsible for repairing it. They also hunted for food and protected their families. Women cooked and cleaned, set up camp, and were responsible for managing their family's supplies. They also cared for and taught their children. Children helped out where they could and collected buffalo chips or manure that was used as fuel for campfires. So here, the picture here is a wagon train traveling west with the Rocky Mountains in the background. So again, the wagon train would be several families traveling together. All right, so here we have a primary source in their words, Sarah Bird, and this was from an interview of Bird recalling her journey to Oregon on February 28th of 1939. We came from Iowa in 1848. That's a long time ago, ain't it? Joe Watt was captain of our train. Being so little, I don't remember how many was in the train, but I've heard him say it was a big one. Every night we camped the wagons, was pulled in a circle and hooked together with chains of oxen yokes. The folks camped inside that circle, and close alongside was livestock, and a guard was set up for the night. Yes, it must have been an awful job cooking. I was too little to do anything. Course, they had to cook on the open fire, and on the plains most of the time there was nothing to burn but buffalo chips. I guess they got used to it, but I wouldn't like to. Okay, and again, that was from an interview with Sarah Bird, talking about her journey to Oregon. Along the trail, conditions could be difficult. The settlers had to face dangerous thunderstorms, floods, snow and ice, rocky terrain, and deep rivers. Disease was also a danger, as settlers lacked access to good medical care. Each obstacle put the people and their precious supplies in danger. The dangers didn't stop people from using the trails, however. By 1861, about 300,000 people had traveled the Oregon Trail to the west. All right, continuing on with the age of Jackson. As the United States expanded westward, the government began to include members of Congress who gave a voice to the needs and opinions of Western settlers. In 1824, only about 360,000 American citizens voted. Then, new laws allowed all white men aged 21 or older to vote. Before then, only wealthy male landowners could vote. 4 years later, the number of voters increased more than 200% to about 1.2 million. This surge of new voters, farmers, frontier settlers, and city workers, helped elect a common man, Andrew Jackson, as president in 1828. Born on the frontier, Jackson was a farmer politician with no college education or public speaking skills. He had fought in the Revolutionary War at the age of 13 and later became a popular general during the War of 1812. This man of the people went on to become one of the most powerful and controversial presidents in U.S. history. Jackson's actions as president ignited much conflict. Opponents accused Jackson of trying to take away Congress's power. He vetoed much legislation, preventing Congress from passing the laws it wanted. One major conflict arose in South Carolina. When Congress passed a new federal tax on imported goods in 1832, South Carolina politicians threatened to leave the Union. Because Southern states had few local industries, they relied on imported products. The new tax would make these products very expensive. Jackson responded to South Carolina's threat by sending troops and warships to force the state to pay the tax. The action enraged citizens who compared the move to Britain's attempts to enforce new tax on colonists in the 1700s. So again, there's a picture here of Chief Justice John Marshall as he swears in Andrew Jackson as president. So that's what this picture here is representing. And if that face looks familiar, that is Andrew Jackson, who is on the $20 bill. Just in case you were wondering. Another controversial action by Jackson concerned the Second Bank of the United States, which helped to manage the nation's money supply. Convinced that the charter of the Bank of the United States was unconstitutional, Jackson removed all of the federal government's money from the bank in 1836. He ordered that the money be transferred to state and local banks. There was no regulations in place to monitor these banks, however. Many of them made unwise investments in land. When the economy weakened in 1837, the invested money could not be recovered. The man of the people had caused a major economic crisis, putting many working people he claimed to represent in difficult times. We have the Indian Removal Act. In the early 1800s, Native Americans in the Southeast were protected by the treaties signed with the U.S. government. The treaties guaranteed their right to their homeland and protection from settlers. Native American communities flourished with their own schools and local governments. Life alongside settlers was peaceful until settlers began demanding more land. Settlers' demands for land increased when gold was discovered on Cherokee lands in Georgia. Conflict grew worse. As General Andrew Jackson had fought several campaigns against Native Americans, he believed that Native Americans threatened the expansion of the United States. He supported violating the treaties to free up more land for white settlers. He believed that moving Native Americans to land west of the Mississippi. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, and Andrew Jackson signed it into law. This law forced Native Americans to leave their homelands so settlers could live there. The act allowed the U.S. government to relocate Native Americans to Indian Territory in parts of what is now Oklahoma. So if we look at this map up top here, I'm going to zoom out one time so we can see it just a little bit closer. We can see where different Native American tribes were settled at, and the trails and the journey they had to take to relocate to what they said are now parts of Oklahoma. So you can see the Cherokee in orange, the Chickasaw in red, the Choctaw in purple, the Seminole in green, so they were down here in West Florida, and the Muskogee in yellow. All right, so you can see, and this was also known as the Trail of Tears, and we talked a little bit about this previously this week. So let's go ahead and read a little more about the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears. The Cherokee fought against the Indian Removal Act. Led by Chief John Ross, they took their case to court and sued the state of Georgia. Eventually, the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, ruled in favor of the Cherokee, determining that the laws of Georgia can have no force on Native American lands. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote the following to explain the court's opinion. So this is a primary source in their words of Chief Justice John Marshall. Treaties have been duly ratified by the Senate of the United States of America, and by which treaties the United States of America acknowledged the said Cherokee Nation to be a sovereign nation, authorized to govern themselves and all persons who have settled within their territory, free from any right of legislative interference by the several states composing the United States of America in reference to the acts done within their own territory, and by which the treaties, the whole of the territory now occupied by the Cherokee Nation on the east of the Mississippi has been solemnly guaranteed to them, all of which treaties are existing treaties at this day and in full force. So that was from Worcester versus Georgia ruling in 1831. So essentially, Chief Justice John Marshall is saying the treaty that was signed saying that the Native Americans' lands would not be touched is going to be upheld, and he's saying that they have no reason to break it. President Jackson ignored that ruling, however. He ordered soldiers to force the Cherokee off the lands they legally owned. In 1838, General Winfield Scott led about 7,000 federal troops onto Cherokee lands in northwest Georgia and neighboring areas. He told the Cherokee that they were surrounded, escape was impossible, and force would be used if they did not comply. The soldiers then burned the Cherokees' homes and forced them to travel 800 miles into Indian Territory. So these are in their words, primary source from Chief John Ross, and he was, again, it says from a letter to the U.S. Congress, 1836. It says, "We are overwhelmed. Our hearts are sickened. Our utterance is paralyzed. When we reflect on the condition in which we are placed by the audacious practices of unprincipled men. In truth, our case is your own. It is the cause of liberty and justice. It is based upon your own principles, which we have learned from yourselves. For we have gloried to your Count, your Washington, and your Jefferson, our great teachers." So again, from Chief John Ross, the chief of the Cherokee nation, saying that we learned from you. This is how we went about the right ways to try to save our lands, and you overthrew that, and you turned over that ruling that the state said, no, we should be able to keep our lands, and you forced us out. So it's like you are going against your own rulings in your Constitution. And so he was very upset about that. So of the approximately 15,000 Cherokee forced to leave their homes, about 2,000 died in camps waiting for the move to begin. During the one-year march, another 2,000 Cherokee died from disease, starvation, and severe weather conditions. The Cherokee called this forced march the place where they cried. In English, it became known as the Trail of Tears. We have the Seminole Wars. Andrew Jackson had a long history of interfering with the rights of Native Americans, starting when he was a general in the U.S. military. It was then that he first became involved in the wars between the U.S. military and the Seminole people of Florida. In the First Seminole War in 1817, General Jackson led forces in an invasion of Seminole land to recapture runaway enslaved people that the Seminole had welcomed. U.S. soldiers burned down the towns in this region. When Jackson became president, he again attempted to relocate the Seminole in Florida and take over their land. Settlers and Jackson sought to enforce the Indian Removal Act in Florida. Some of the Seminole formed an army under the leadership of Chief Osceola and fought against U.S. troops. When the U.S. Army approached Osceola, claiming to come in peace, they took him prisoner. He later died in prison. Even so, the Seminole continued fighting to remain in Florida. By the end of the Seminole Wars, U.S. soldiers had removed 3,000 Seminoles from their Florida homes and killed 1,500 more. So the picture here is Chief Osceola of the Seminoles. Okay, and lastly, we have a war with Mexico. By 1835, more than 25,000 Americans, including 2,000 enslaved people, had moved to Mexico's Texas province. But the Americans did not want to accept Mexico's conditions for the land. Becoming Mexican citizens, taking up Catholicism, and following Mexico's laws, which included a ban on slavery. In December of 1835, 500 Americans, including Stephen Austin, attacked San Antonio. They took control of the Alamo, a Spanish mission that the Mexican army had turned into a fort. On March 2nd of 1836, the Americans declared their independence and established the Republic of Texas. 4 days later, Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna recaptured the Alamo, killing every American inside. A month later, inspired by the battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," Texas General Sam Houston attacked and defeated a large Mexican force at San Jacinto. The Republic of Texas stood. In 1845, The U.S. Congress voted to accept Texas into the Union. U.S. President James K. Polk also wanted to buy California and other Mexican territories. Mexico said no. Finally, a disagreement between the United States and Mexico over Texas's border led to war. In 1847, U.S. troops attacked Mexico City, and the Mexican government agreed to end the war. Both nations signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Mexico would sell 320 million acres of land to the United States, and the Rio Grande was recognized as Texas's southern border. The future states of California, Nevada, and Utah, and parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming were also part of the deal. In 1854, the Gadsden Purchase added 29,670 square miles to this area and created the existing southern border of the United States.